Hello, Kevin Sheedy. We have read your letter regarding you and your club searching for people who have a good understanding of sports science principles and are able to apply coaching principles. We have created a 5-minute video in response to your search that acknowledges Newton's 3 laws of motion and how they can be applied into everyday life and sport, in our case, rugby league.
I'm here with the Dundas Shamrocks. You with me, team?
Yeah!
Let's go!
There are many biochemical principles that are involved in NRL, especially when executing a tackle. Tackling is a central aspect of play in rugby league. There is a 6-tackle changeover until the opposition gains possession of the ball. Therefore, there are 2 main aims in the game in attacking and defensive modes: scoring a try and reducing the amount of ground gained on the field by an opposition through tackling. The centre of gravity and force is utilised in the sport, and so is the kinetic chain to achieve optimal summation of force throughout the game. But what does any of this have to do with the Newton's 3 laws of motion? And what are the Newton's 3 laws of motion?
Before we establish Newton's 3 laws of motion and how they are relevant to everyday life, and in particular rugby league, we need to understand how force is measured. The units for force is newtons, which is written as N. A newton is the force required to give a mass of 1 kilogram and acceleration of 1 meter per second. Now, let's take a look at Newton's 3 laws of motion.
Newton's first law of motion states that an object at rest will remain at rest unless acted on by an unbalanced force. An object in motion continues in motion with the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. This law is often called the law of inertia. In simpler terms, this law means that every object remains in a state of uniform motion unless acted upon by external force.
For example, if a car were to stop, the person would continue to project forward if it weren't for the hindrance of the seatbelt, the external force. This law is apparent in a rugby league game. As you can see in this football game, if the player were to continue running with the football, they would continue in their intended path unless acted upon by a tackler. The greater the mass of the player can also be advantageous, as they are less likely to be stopped by the outside forces. The prime objective of the tackle is to off-center the opponent and throw them off balance. This means that the tackler needs to overcome their opponent's combinational momentum and produce a higher amount of force to successfully execute the skill.
Newton's second law of motion states that acceleration is produced when a force acts on a mass. The greater the mass of the object is accelerated, the greater the amount of the force needed to accelerate the object. This law gives us the equation: force equals mass times acceleration.
An example would be pushing a car versus pushing a lawnmower. Obviously, more force would be required to push the car because it has a greater mass. This law is in action in rugby league, when a player with a football has a greater mass compared to the tackler. As proven in this football game, this means that the tackler must put more force into tackling the player with the ball than he would if he was tackling a person with a smaller mass. Throwing the opponent off balance in NRL is needed to execute the tackle successfully. However, the person tackling their opponent must have greater force to do so. If the player is tackling an opponent with a larger body mass, then he would then neutralize this by having a greater amount of acceleration. Summation of force is very important when tackling. In doing so, the base support of the player needs to be stable. A greater amount of force is exerted when the player is balanced and stable, as the muscles are more readily available to be used. The sequential summation of force is needed to overcome the opposing team's play's momentum.
Newton's third law of motion states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. This means that for every force there is a reaction force that is equal in size but opposite in direction.
Take a chair for example. When you sit in a chair, your body exerts a downward force on the chair, while the chair is exerting an upward force on your body. that is equal to the downward force on your body. This law is also evident in the stance position of a player in NRL. As seen in this football game, by lowering the player's centre of gravity and squatting, they are able to gather more force by pushing off the ground. The player is then greeted with the equal amount of force from the ground in a push-off like movement. The way in which the tackler is able to remain stable and balanced in this position is therefore essential. The same amount of force that the tackler pushes into the ground will be the same amount that he receives through his leg muscles, assisting the forward push-like motion into his opponent. Now that we have reviewed Newton's 3 laws of motion, we need to acknowledge gravity and how it can enhance our sporting abilities, especially in NRL.
The centre of gravity is the select point around a body's mass or weight is evenly distributed as acted by gravitational force. Therefore, the biomechanical principle of centre of gravity and mass can be used to improve tackling play throughout the game.
Throughout the patterns of the plays in NRL, the centre of gravity is constantly changing. As seen in this football game, the centre of gravity plays an important role in the prior stages of a tackle. By lowering the centre of gravity, the player needs to be in a squat-like position by bending their knees and slightly bending forward, having their torso arching forward. This then moves their centre of gravity forward also. When tackling, this stance is then progressively shifted as the player then needs to step forward into a tackle. Not only is the centre of gravity then shifted forward with this step, but it also increases the amount of force exerted on the opponent. The rugby league player who is executing the tackle should aim at creating instability to their opponent. The mass of the opponent then becomes irrelevant if the tackler is able to take them off balance. The greater the mass of the opponent, the greater force that is required to overcome inertia. This proves that stability and balance are required in maintaining an optimal centre of gravity. In conclusion, Newton's 3 laws of motion are evident in not just everyday life, but can be used to enhance sporting abilities in sport, including rugby league.
To a semi-final. That is so exciting.